есть город, который я вижу во сне. О, если бы знали, как дорог у Черного моря открывшийся мне в цветущих акациях город, в цветущих акациях город у Черного моря.
Я скажу сначала пару слов по-русски и потом по-английски. I'll say a few words in Russian first and then in English to introduce this paper. Официально в программке у вас написано, что выступает Анжела Шпольберг, я Маша Шпольберг, я ее дочка, я объясняю. Анжела, к сожалению, в Штатах не могла приехать, но я думаю, что это очень по теме нашей конференции, по теме передачи информации от матерей к детям и через поколения, как то, о чем говорила Лоранс. Поэтому я надеюсь, что я смогу адекватно представить ее доклад. Я попробую ответить на вопросы, но, скорее всего, не смогу ответить на все. И я хотела просто сказать еще по-русски, и я скажу все то же самое потом по-английски. Что мне кажется, что у всех наших докладов есть одна нить, которая их связывает. И для меня это то, что женщины, они бывают жертвами истории, они бывают участницами истории, но они заодно и авторы истории. Мы видим, как женщины пишут историю. И я надеюсь, что доклад, который я дам сейчас, поможет нам подумать чуть-чуть о том, что женщины замечают в истории и как они ее пишут, и как это может отличаться от того, как это пишут другие люди. So now I'll switch to English. So as you may have noticed in your program, it says that Angela Shpolberg is presenting, and I'm Masha Shpolberg. I'm her daughter. Angela is in the States, and unfortunately could not be with us today. But I think that it's in keeping with the themes of this conference to have a mother-daughter channeling situation happening here. And I just wanted to say that to me, listening to all of the papers as the last person to go, I see that there is a theme that's running through all of our papers, which is that women are both the subjects of history, they're the agents of history, but they're also the authors of history. I really loved seeing how women write history and help us write history. And I hope that the paper that I'm going to give, you'll see it's also very basic. It just presents some historical information about a few women who lived. But I hope that it will help us think about the things that women notice when they do historical writing. And so I will start the paper. And the paper talks about American women in the Russian Revolution. So now I'm channeling my mother. From now on, I'm speaking in her voice. So dear friends, thank you for coming. I would like to invite you to travel 100 years back in time to the year 1917. The political and social events that took place that year in Russia affected the development of the world. Debates over the legacy of 1917 have been ongoing. Scholarly literature about the events is abundant. The centenary of the Russian Revolution is an important milestone in modern historical and political discourse. It is a moment to look back in perspective and reconsider what happened then, how it affected the world, and what lessons we can learn from it. For our convenience, we will use the common term Russian Revolution during the talk, but the term is not historically technically correct, since the revolution was not a single event, but was many years in coming. The revolution has its roots in the 19th century in Russia, in the earlier revolution of 1905, where the first Soviets were created, and in the bloody years of World War I. In February 1917, the Russian Tsar abdicated, and the liberal provisional government was formed. It was supposed to govern in collaboration with the Duma, the Russian parliament, and lots of hopes were placed on the modernization and the liberalization of the country. The population, even the nobility, was ready to cooperate with the new government. It was clear that the country couldn't survive under the old autocratic way of ruling. However, the provisional government made a series of huge strategic mistakes and turned out to be very weak. Violent political turmoil and rivalry between the provisional government and the Bolsheviks took place in July 1917. And in October of 1917, the Bolsheviks took power in the country and announced the dictatorship of the proletariat. So that's the backstory that many of you probably know very well. Fortunately, there are many eyewitness accounts of the events of 1917 in Russia. And interestingly enough, already in 1919, the New York Times Review of Books pointed out, quote, "There have been several excellent books of impressions of events in Russia. Singularly enough, some of the best of them have been written by women." Professor Choi Chatterjee, in her research on gender and American travel narratives of 1917 to 1920, specified, and here, если можно, два слайда вперед. So I'll read the quote, but I'm putting it up there so it's easier for you to follow. Women were writing good social and cultural history at a time when political history was the norm. Women writers rarely kept a safe distance from the people they were observing. Instead, they insisted on inserting themselves into the historical narrative and recording their personal experiences of the revolution. End quote. And today, this paper will introduce 5 extraordinary American women who witnessed the fateful events of 1917 in Russia. These women came from very different social backgrounds, and they were brought to Russia by very different circumstances. And that's what makes it so interesting to analyze and to compare their points of view. Regardless of their position, all of these women wish to understand and not to judge the changes. Their texts are very non-judgmental for the most part. And they try to be as objective as possible. And so our first heroine that I will introduce is Princess Julia Cantacuzène, Countess Speransky, and she was actually the granddaughter of Ulysses S. Grant, the 18th President of the United States. She was born in the White House in the US, and while traveling to Rome with her aunt's family in 1893, at the age of 17, she met a young Russian diplomat, the Prince Mikhail Cantacuzène. In 1899, the couple was married in Newport. We have the Great Society photo there, so you get a sense of the times. And for the next 17 years, she lived in Russia, in an usazba, in a great estate. And she moved in the top levels of the Petersburg aristocracy. In the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, she and her husband, then a general of the Imperial Army, managed to escape St. Petersburg for Sweden, and then the United States, where Julia championed the cause of Russian aristocratic exiles and organized the American Central Committee for Russian Relief. She subsequently published 3 memoirs of her time in Russia. The first one was called Revolutionary Days, and I love this little addition here, including passages from, and that's the title of her other book, My Life Here and There, which is a great title. And the book opened with the following words. I'll give you the quote. Quote, "These pages merely contain my personal recollection of what occurred around me from the beginning of the war until our departure from home. There is no pretense to literary merit, and I do not aspire to present one political party in a more advantageous light than I do the others. In each group, I noticed many a loyal patriot trying to stem the fatal flood, and everywhere there was much suffering. Recent Russian history has been so startling and so weighted with importance for us that all I saw and heard fixed itself in my mind." End quote. And I will present these women sort of one by one just because we don't have the time, but if you have questions, I might be able to say more in depth about each one. And so the next one is Florence Harper, who, unlike Julia Cantacuzène, all of the women to follow, in what I will tell you, were journalists, professional journalists. Florence Harper was a reporter for Leslie's Weekly, which was the oldest illustrated American newspaper. And she was sent to Russia on assignment as a job, together with a photographer, Captain Donald Thompson, to cover the events of World War I on the Russian front. Harper and Thompson arrived in Petrograd, which was the name of St. Petersburg at that time, in February 1917, and suddenly found themselves living through the crash of the Russian Empire, the chaos of the revolution, and the birth of something entirely new. They courageously threw themselves into the cauldron of events on the front and in and around the Russian capital until August 1917, when they left for the USA. So they weren't there in October, but they were there up until right before. And since their focus was on the pictorial documentation of events, they created a fascinating record of what they saw in the form of Thompson's photo book, which had the very kind of menacing title called Blood-Stained Russia. And Harper's book, Runaway Russia. So that's Runaway Russia, and we can do one more. This is Blood-Stained Russia. I wanted to show you the cover, and also the opening page, which has a photograph of Maria Bochkareva on the inside of the cover page. And I will talk more about Maria in a second. And so both of these books were published in 1918, so right in the midst of things. And in the introduction, so Florence Harper wrote the introduction to the photo book. And in the introduction, she wrote, we knew at the time that we were witnessing the stupendous spectacle of a nation of 170,000 people winning and losing its liberty. But we little realized what a tremendous effect upon the struggle of freedom of the world the Russian tragedy was about to have. So here there is a recognition that the Russian experiment, as a lot of these writers would call it, had world import almost immediately after the fact. The third character in the story is a woman named Retta Child-Dorr. And Retta Child-Dorr was an activist. She was not as objective as the last woman. She was one of the leading journalists of the Progressive Era, and also the first editor of a journal called The Suffragist. And she came to Russia not on assignment, but deliberately. It was her decision. And she came for almost the same 3 months as Florence Harper. She was there between May and August 1917. And her aim was to witness what she called herself the days of the great changes. Upon return home, she made a strong statement in her own book. So these books are proliferating all over the place. And that book was called Inside the Russian Revolution, which you can see right there. This is a modern cover of the book. I couldn't find an old one. And so this is a quote from her book, from what she had to say. Quote, early in May 1917, I went to Russia, eager to see again in the hour of her deliverance, the country in whose struggle for freedom I had for a dozen years been deeply interested. I went to Russia a socialist by conviction, an ardent sympathizer with the revolution, knowing personally some of the brave men and women who suffered imprisonment and exile after the failure of the uprising in 1905 and 1906. I returned from Russia with a very clear conviction that the world will have to wait a while before it can establish any cooperative millenniums, or before it can safely hand over the work of government to the man in the streets. So there's a clear strain of disappointment in her writing already, and I highly recommend the book in general if you want to see somebody who's thinking through things in a much more critical way immediately. And then we have our fourth woman, whose name was Bessie Beatty, who was Retta Child-Dorr's colleague, and they were friends. And Bessie Beatty stayed in the country much longer. She was there from June to February 1918, so she witnessed the whole, from June 1917 until February 1918. And she basically witnessed the whole thing. For Beatty, she sort of, her style of writing is to describe everything as a fun adventure, which is a little disconcerting when you read her book. And she was writing for the San Francisco Bulletin in the spring of 1917. And her job was to travel around the world and write a series of articles entitled Around the Globe at War. The newspaper's idea was to repeat the Around the World tour performed by journalist Nellie Bly for Joseph Pulitzer's New York World newspaper, which in its turn was inspired by Jules Verne's novel Around the World in 80 Days. Fulfilling the assignment, Bessie Beatty went through Hawaii, Japan, China, and the Russian Far East, and rode the Trans-Siberian Railway. Sorry. She arrived in St. Petersburg in June of 1917. And that's where her journey ended, and she sort of got stuck there for a while and decided to stay. And the real adventure started. She found herself stuck in the middle of revolutionary events, but she did not complain. Instead, she herself too wrote a book called The Red Heart of Russia. And she wrote, quote, I have been alive at a great moment, and I knew it was great. And now we're getting almost to the end. So the last heroes are actually a married couple, John Reed and Louise Bryant, who arrived in Petrograd in September 1917. And Beatty joined them because Reed's credentials, Reed was known in the States as a communist supporter, gave the trio access to revolutionary leaders and the main locations where critical events unfolded. And so it was Bessie Beatty, Louise Bryant, and John Reed who created the first poignant English language descriptions of the October of 1917 when the Bolsheviks took power. Adventurous Beatty obtained all the possible permissions and risked being arrested multiple times, but she wanted to be at the epicenter of events and succeeded in doing so. She managed to make her way into the fortress of Peter and Paul to interview political prisoners. And it was also Beatty who described in details the negotiations between the Germans and the Bolsheviks in Brest-Litovsk when Russia decided to withdraw from World War I. I'm going to skip over Louise Bryant because I see Ella telling me that I have very little time left. And I want to make sure that I get to Maria Bachkarova very quickly. And so almost all of these American women were very impressed by the fact that so many Russian women wanted to fight. And actually in World War I, the men started deserting. And to set an example for the men, there was actually a women's battalion that was formed. A women's battalion was formed, which was led by a woman named Maria Bachkarova, who was a peasant, but who had wanted to fight for a long time and had been petitioning for a women's battalion. And so the time was kind of right that her request was heard, and a women's battalion of death was formed. And a lot of these American journalists interviewed her, celebrated her, and included her in their books. And it also became a big part of the discourse, this question of the woman with the gun, and the role of the woman with the gun. I'm basically summarizing my mother's talk right now, so I'll run down. But the last figure, who was on the Russian side, was a woman named Katerina Bishkovskaya. These are images of the women's battalion. And Catherine Bershkovsky was considered the grandmother of the revolution, and she was also another one of these women who was often included as a frontispiece in the front of the books, mostly because she had been fighting for the revolutionary cause for a very long time, had been in exile in Siberia for a while. And the important thing here is that in all of these American accounts of the revolution is always gendered as female. Because you have these women on the cover, and because you have this emphasis on the women present there. And the other thing, of course, is that in their accounts, the things that almost all of these women stress are the social conditions, how family life is changing, all of those things that we now call social history, that the men at the time who were writing the books were not writing. And so this is an alternative archive that we can read if we want to get more of the everyday social history and the political history that was written at the time. Thank you.